Now it's time to learn the detailed steps of creating a VM in VirtualBox. The objective of this lecture is to create a virtual machine that we will install and configure to be our first domain controller. A domain controller is a Microsoft server that is responsible for security authentication within a Windows domain. A domain controller can also manage computer and user accounts that are inside of its domains. You can also do things like remotely deploy software to the computers, change a user's desktop background, configure scheduled tasks, manage Windows updates, and much, much more. The first thing we need to do is open VirtualBox. Next, either select the New button in the top left-hand corner of the screen or select Machine, New. Also, you can press left Control and N. The Create Virtual Machine window will appear. Choose the Expert Mode button in the bottom part of the screen and wait for the window to reappear. Now you need to enter the VM name, type, version, memory size, and whether or not you want to create a hard disk. I'm going to put the name as Windows Server 2016-DC01. Now this is not actually the computer name, but the name that VirtualBox will use when storing the VM in its inventory. The DC01 part stands for Domain Controller 01, meaning that it's the first domain controller in our environment. Notice that I selected Windows Server 2012 64-bit as the version. This is because VirtualBox has not updated their software to include the latest version of Windows Server, which right now is less than a month old. Do not worry if you only see Windows Server 2012 as the latest option, as it will run the newer OS perfectly fine. Of course, if they have updated the software by now and you have version 2016 available, go ahead and choose 2016. Under the memory size, I'm going to specify 4096 megabytes. I know some of my students have gotten away with using as little as 1 gigabyte of RAM or 1024 megabytes of RAM. And if you have an older or slower computer, you can try this option to see if it'll work. Now my host computer has 16 gigabytes of RAM, so I'm going to go ahead and use 4 gigs for this VM. Remember that later we can change this and lower this number if we like. Notice that you cannot allocate more RAM than what your physical system has. So for example, I couldn't set the VM's RAM to 17 gigabytes since my host only has 16 gigabytes. Under hard disk, I'm going to leave Create a Virtual Hard Disk Now radial box checked, and I'm going to click Create. The next screen is asking us to create the virtual hard disk. The most important thing that we do on this screen is that we drag the file size slider to at least 60 gigabytes. Next, I also recommend that under Storage on Physical Hard Disk, you choose Dynamically Allocated. Let's say we set the file size slider to 60 gigabytes. And under Storage on Physical Hard Disk, we choose Fixed Size. What that means is our hard disk file will always be 60 gigabytes no matter how much data is stored on the hard drive. On the other hand, if we choose Dynamically Allocated, that means our hard disk file will only go up to 60 gigabytes, but will also remain as small as possible depending on how much data is actually on the virtual hard disk file. Now click Create. And now we can see the VM has been created and is listed in our inventory. Now let's learn how to edit the settings of the VM. You may do this by right-clicking on the VM and choosing Settings, or selecting the VM and pressing left Control and S. Now there are a lot of settings here, so I'm just going to point out what I believe are the most important. Under the General tab, select Advanced and change the Shared Clipboard and Drag and Drop to Bidirectional. This will allow you to copy and paste and drag and drop between your host computer and your VM. Be warned, this feature does constantly fail in VirtualBox, but it is extremely convenient when it is actually working. You will also need to install the Guest Editions virtual disk before this will work. If you would like to add an additional hard disk file, this can be done under the Storage tab by clicking the floppy disk with a plus sign and choosing Add Hard Disk. You may also add additional virtual disk drives, as in CD or DVD drives if required, but that is not necessary for our purposes. To mount an ISO to the default virtual disk drive, select the disk icon that reads Empty and choose the disk drop-down on the right-hand side of the screen and choose Virtual Optical Disk File. Next, you need to navigate and select the ISO you wish to mount. If you have a physical CD that you would like to mount, you can simply select Host Drive instead of Virtual Optical Disk File. The Network tab allows us to configure VM networking adapters as well as add subsequent networking adapters. Notice that the default option is the NAT adapter. This is because a NAT adapter is the easiest to use when getting started. Finally, we have the Shared Folders tab. This allows you to share files from your host computer between your guest VM without a direct network connection. You may create a new shared folder and select a valid path on your host PC. Be sure to choose Auto Mount for convenience if you choose this. You may click OK or Cancel to close this window. And that's all we need to cover in this lecture. You now know how to create a virtual machine and edit its settings. Great job with this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.